Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Danny Allan, CTO at Veeam Software. Danny, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And today we are going to talk about industry cloud. They are kind of, depending on how you look at them, they're kind of finally taking off. In general, from my perception, they are more or less like, cloud providers are bundling, services, tools, application targeted as specific use case. Sometimes I look at it, old days, not old days, traditional word, we had like custom software is specific to a specific use case or industry. So when we look at general public cloud, it is anybody can go in there, use the services that they want. That is my perception. But I want to hear from you. How do you look at industry clouds? How different they are from, you can say, commodity or, in general public cloud?
Differences are probably less than you think between industry-specific clouds and general clouds. One of the things that clearly comes into play is around compliance and regulations. So a lot of the industry-specific clouds understand the regulatory pressures that a specific vertical falls under, and they take advantage of providing the services and capabilities and logging and things that you need. They'll also look at all of the underlying components. So if you think about authentication and authorization and logging and third-party access, a lot of that is built into the service. Most of the time, I would say that the industry-specific clouds are built on top of existing clouds. It's just that additional controls are added to it.
So the difference between, let's say, industry-specific cloud versus general cloud is just additional services that need for compliance, or it's more geared towards a specific industry use cases, like let's say retail industry, they might have a totally different requirement. Manufacturing may have a totally different requirement than, let's say, or audio streaming service.
I would say they're built on the same foundation, but there are additional services, not just in the compliance space. It is true in compliance, but they'll have things like, if you're in a manufacturing environment, for example, there may be a specific application that's being used. I know in healthcare, you'll hear a lot about Meditech and Epic. Those applications will often be pre-installed. If you're talking about Internet of Things, you'll have databases specific to data collection. So it's typically built on a common foundation, but there's additional compliance and components to help the organization meet whatever goals they're trying to achieve.
So is it more or less like when these specific industries, they consume public cloud, they do need additional layers? So more or less, cloud providers are bringing those layers within the realm of cloud itself. That's what is happening to make it easier for those players?
Yes, the whole goal of this is to reduce the time to market for the organizations within the industry, make it easier for them. And of course, if you package up the services, you package up the applications, you make sure all the compliance requirements are there, that makes it faster to bring something to market. It's also true that sometimes you find an ecosystem. So you'll have other organizations very similar to yourself that you partner with, and they also will be running off the same cloud.
One thing with the cloud, public cloud, is sometimes folks think that once you move to the cloud, all of your problems are gone, which is not the reality. When we move to this industry-specific cloud, where a lot of things that are specific to your use case are also moving to the cloud. Can you also talk about what are the myths, what are the realities, so that we do understand the line where it's drawn there?
Sure. So the first thing I always tell people is you have to understand that it's your data, and you still own all of the requirements that go along with that data. So while the cloud is providing underlying infrastructure and components, when it comes to things like performance or security or data protection, you still are responsible for all of the data running in the cloud. And so what you find is a shifting of responsibilities. It used to be that the IT organizations or the governance organizations were managing everything from the infrastructure all the way up to the application. And what we found is that organizations then typically focus on the higher level services like security, like governance, like data protection when they move to these clouds. The other thing I always warn customers about, you should always understand what your off-ramp is. Going into the cloud tends to be relatively easy, but what does the egress look like? If you need for some reason to move that service out of the cloud back on premises or to another geography, are you prepared to exit that particular industry cloud.
You talk about, even if you move to cloud, you're still on the data, but the fact is that cloud, they have their own data gravity as well. So how to have that escape velocity, as you mentioned, so that you are not get too much vendor locked into the specific provider?
Well, data has gravity, as you mentioned. So if you're talking about a manufacturing plant, for example, it might be that they can't even use cloud because they need the data at the edge where they're working with it. And so understanding the context of your application, of your service, what you're trying to deliver is very important. And the data gravity will ultimately determine, can you run it at the edge? Do you run it in your data center? Or sometimes, and it's often the case now, is it better to run it in a verticalized or industry-specific cloud?
You mentioned edge. Depending on how people look at it, there are different perspectives of looking at it. It could also be seen as a small IoT device, or it could just be a data center at the edge, or instead of going far from the user, data center near the user. So in terms of industry-specific cloud, do you see that, number one, edge? Second is the proliferation of private 5G network is kind of enabling that as well?
Yes, there's no question. So as you point out, what is the edge is the first question. And typically, if you're talking to a retail organization, for example, the store is the edge. Or if you're talking to a manufacturing center, typically the factory is the edge. But then you want that to work in conjunction with the centralized environment, because if you're a retail store, you want to send your data to a central repository. And same thing, if you're a manufacturing center, you might want to send it back to the headquarters. And that can be the cloud or the centralized data center. And so we're seeing these work in conjunction with one another. So it's never a question of or, it's always a question of and. It's a hybrid world where often actually the industry-specific clouds will give you a component to run out at the edge that is predetermined and pre-configured to work really cleanly with the centralized environment.
You talked about that earlier, and I just want to go a bit into detail is once again the difference between general purpose cloud versus industry cloud. It could be from the either perspective of cloud providers or from the users, is that what are some specific unique challenges that you are seeing that comes with industry specific cloud when they have added additional services on top of existing ones just to cater to that specific use case?
Well, one of the things that you have to consider is what is going to differentiate you. If everyone within your industry is doing the exact same thing in the same industry cloud, you have the same outcome. And so understanding what is going to differentiate you, and often it's the data itself. So if you're just adopting the same solution that everyone else is, you're not really determining what that differentiation is. And so as you go to an industry-specific cloud, it's still important to understand what are the things that make you unique over and above what is in that default industry cloud.
How much adoption have you seen of, how popular is industry cloud is becoming that you have seen?
It's hard to say exactly how broad it is. What I'll say in specific verticals, I see it taking off. If you take very simple things like the government, GovCloud is actually a specific kind of industry cloud. And we see a lot of government organizations that are moving into, for example, AWS GovCloud. You see in specific environments like manufacturing where organizations, the ISVs will actually put their software in a pre-configured cloud and then leverage that, sell that out to the manufacturing plants and organizations. But I'd say adoption is relatively low right now. I don't have a scientific number, but if I had to guess, less than 20% of the industry. And I do think we're going to see that accelerate over the next 3 or 4 years.
The reason I asked that question was also to understand that if we have enough data to also see what are the, because, without adoption, we won't even know the pitfalls, the mistakes that folks are making or the lessons they have learned, so that, based on the small user base that you've seen, have you seen any pattern where, people are realizing, hey, this is how it should not be done, or this is how it should be done? What are the lessons they have learned?
Yes, everyone thinks of the cloud, whether it's general cloud or industry-specific cloud, as resource pooling. I actually believe that probably the greater advantage is the knowledge pooling. One of the things that you're getting just by default at the infrastructure level is how do I configure the applications and deliver the applications securely? But then there's knowledge sharing again, even above that. You can go to your peers who are also using those applications and using those services, and you can learn from them best practices. And so one of the significant benefits that you get from cloud, above just the technology, the resource sharing, is the knowledge sharing that is coming both from the cloud provider, but also from peers if you're in collaboration work group.
When we talk about knowledge sharing, I cannot, not talk about tribal knowledge and technical debt that comes. So folks, and especially in this economy, folks are moving, they are moving around. So, sometimes that knowledge goes with them. So how do you look at it? And if I ask, what's advice you have for folks who are moving to industry-specific cloud so they can, prepare themselves. So as people move, they should not, lose that edge there.
Well, this is an easy one because I work for Veeam Software. And one of the things that we do data protection on is all the communication that happens through email or Microsoft Teams and all of the different channels of communication. And so protecting and having copies of that information and IP is especially critical, because if you lose employees who have that in their head, then at least you have a backup. You have a copy of that data to be mined at some later date to help you as an organization provide better services.
And since you brought it in, that creates a perfect segue to my next question, which was going to be more or less about when we look at these industry-specific clouds, what kind of a threat may not be a good word, but challenges that are there in terms of data protection and how Veeam actually help folks. So once again, you talked about one issue, but then there are a lot of other issues because as we discussed earlier, cloud is not a magical place, though it looked like one. So talk about data protection landscape for industry-specific cloud.
Well, data protection for industry-specific clouds is probably not a whole lot different than you would think of for on-premises or the general cloud. So you have data protection, of course, for operating systems. We're used to backup of, your physical laptop or whatever you're using. And we can clearly do that in a virtual environment, image-based backup. But one of the things that does come into play in industry clouds is that you have specific applications with specific data repositories. So it might be that you need to capture your SQL Server database or your Oracle database in an application consistent format with the application itself. And so what you find is knowing what the applications are, how they're configured, especially in a distributed environment, becomes critical. And of course, Veeam helps with that with our software platform.
Last question, it is once again, kind of addition to what we just discussed is, as we're talking about the adoption is slow, but it will grow, as you mentioned. So as enterprises embrace industry-specific cloud, do you have not entirely a playbooks, but some advice to them that how they should prepare themselves so that not only the move is smooth, but also they can avoid a lot of pitfalls that you talked about earlier?
Well, in all of these situations, we put together run books or playbooks of migration to the cloud or migration to the next generation of services. In fact, one of the things that we do here is we help customers go through that transformation. You can actually take a physical service with our software and say, I want to put it in virtual, and you can hit a button and say, put that in the public cloud, or you can migrate databases from one place to another. So we not only help organizations prepare for that migration and movement, but we'll give them the confidence and the consistency as they go through it to make sure that their data is protected. And if they don't like it, if they do need that exit, that off-ramp, they can roll back to the location that they were before. Because it is true, there is no one-size-fits-all. You might need capacity or application delivery from the cloud for a period of time, but then for compliance or governance or financial reasons, the cloud is not a charity. You might want to pull that back on premises at some point, and we can help with all of that.
One last question is also, as these industries, they do move to the cloud, a lot of things that were on-prem, what kind of, in the context of data, risks that you feel are serious, like ransomware? There are certain things where the data is just gone, it's not destroyed, but so what are the things that you feel could be a potential threat as more and more enterprise move towards industry cloud? Or you think that no, since they're moving to cloud, it's a magical place, you don't have to worry about them?
The key is that the role is shifting. So some people move to cloud and they think it's all taken care of. And the reality is it's not. And what that does is it causes some organizations to lose sight of, oh, I need to do data protection, or I need to make sure security is in place, or I need to make sure my configuration is appropriate. And people ignore that and they become less secure. But in the main, what I would say is moving to the cloud is actually better than on-premises, because at the infrastructure level, these cloud providers, their whole business is about making sure that the availability is there, that the security is there, that things can scale appropriately. So as long as you realize that the roles are shifting and you still have responsibility for the specific top of the stack for the key data capabilities, then generally as an organization, you'll end up in a more secure, a better location than you were if you were running it on premises.
Excellent. And as you earlier said, the way you look at cloud, like resource pooling, that's how people should look at it. Instead of having my own small IT team managing my own server and even worrying about setting an Nginx server and Apache servers and Linux updating, they free themselves from all those someone else's. But that does not mean that your application and other things need no protection. So thanks for bringing that up in the beginning itself.
One of the things that might be interesting to touch on is Kubernetes, because it is changing the way that applications are designed. So if you're writing within containers with container orchestration in Kubernetes, it actually brings an interesting element to cloud that wasn't there before. It gives you a true portability from on-premises, but then also across clouds, whether it be GKE, AKS, EKS. And that also will shift, I believe, the fundamentals of industry clouds and the cloud in general by leveraging container-based services.
Danny, thank you so much for taking time out today and not only share your insights about industry cloud, but also share some of the kind of playbook that how folks should approach and how, that moving to cloud is not magical, but at the same time, it does solve a lot of problem, but that does not mean, as you mentioned, that blindsided by a lot of other things. So thanks for sharing all those insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure being on, and it's exciting to see what's coming in the industry.